Thank you guys for coming to this session. We know we stand between you and probably some drinks, so we appreciate you guys sticking it out for one of the last sessions of the day. My name is Brett Miller. I'm here with Mike Dixon. We are on the professional services team here at AWS. We concentrate on trying to make security easy, right? Who would like to make security and compliance a little bit easier? Right? You're either coming from a different couple set of camps. We see patterns all over the enterprise. Some developers just want to get security out of the way, right? Let me code. And the security folks on the enterprise side want to make sure that all the security is done properly for the data that's in the organization. And usually these things conflict. You have the risk takers in an organization that want to make sure everything is secure, and you have the developers just trying to get things done, right? For the last year and a half, we've seen a lot of these patterns, and we decided to take an idea of trying to make compliance easy to the next level, because we've seen through a lot of our customer engagements that it's still challenging, right? On one side, we have AWS, which releases all these great new features every single year, right? How many people like the features released every year, right? That's pretty cool. But on the other side of the fence, the compliance guys sometimes freak out. They're like, all this new stuff, how do I document it? Is it properly done in the NIST configurations? How do we deal with this, right? And the problem is that we're not treating compliance like we do with our code. We don't use DevOps in compliance up to now, right? We're trying to take an old process, which has worked pretty much the last 20 years pretty well, or not so much, depending on your vantage point, but then trying to use all this new cool cloud technology, and they don't always mesh, right? So we've decided to try to take the power of the cloud, infrastructure as code, and actually bring in the whole compliance piece into this, and actually help developers move faster, right? Have them automate their infrastructure along with all the compliance. Because we feel that if you can automate compliance, you can then have the mission stay up to the speed of where it needs to be. You can never have compliance as a boat anchor, right? It can't be you're moving at the speed of your developers and then all of a sudden needs to be ATO'd and 9 months later you get an ATO, right? That just can't happen, right? We need to fix that. We need to treat compliance just like we do our development processes. CICD, right? DevOps. Those are things you rarely see around compliance. What we've tried to do over the last year and a half is to bridge that gap. Let's try to treat compliance as just another CICD project, another way to innovate to make things faster, make things better for developers, right? If we can make developers happy, where they don't have to worry about all the infrastructure and all the security and it's just done for them, they're happy, and then the compliance people are happy because they know that these environments are being built in a repeatable way over and over again. We feel it's pretty important, and we're going to discuss this today. We're going to go over a lot about compliance automation, and we're also going to do something at the end of this that's never been done before on stage, right? Never. You guys are going to see a demonstration of how compliance for the first time is going to be cool. When has that ever happened? First time today, right? We're going to show you how to do compliance and innovate and use the most current technology we have available in order to do things in a much different way, but in order to keep up with the speed that our developers need us to go on. So let's go to the next slide. Compliance and accreditation. We've seen patterns across our enterprises. These are the same questions we basically see every single day. How do I architect for compliance in AWS? Right? How do I keep up on the technology advancements that AWS releases, and how does that actually translate to the documentation in a NIST 853 or a PCI or a HIPAA? Has anyone felt that pain yet? At least a couple people we know have. How do I validate my architecture is compliant after I deploy it. How many people have got ATOs on systems? In the old way of doing ATOs, an ATO lasted how long? 3 years. Do you think that system stayed the same 3 years after you got your ATO? So that's an important piece of this, right? We have to be able to validate our architectures the same way, either a day plus 1 of their ATO or a day plus 180. We have to be able to do that. In the cloud, we'll show you how you can do that, right? Because everything is an API call, you can actually do continuous monitoring in a real pervasive way that can make sure that everyone understands how a system is configured, and we're going to show you how to do that. All right, everyone usually has to comply to one of these frameworks. Do you guys have to comply to these types of frameworks? We have FedRAMP, 853, FedRAMP, HIPAA, CGIS. Anyone fall into that camp? Most people do in public sector. In public sector, everybody knows they have to be compliant to a certain degree to one of these third-party frameworks. What we're going to just talk to you today is how we can automate a lot of this, right? We can automate the technology. That's what AWS does very well. But what we've done is actually taken the compliance piece and married it up with the automation piece in order to help you go faster. Here's the common responsibility model. Anyone seen this before? Once or twice, right? We've been using this for about 8 years, probably, ever since probably EC2 was actually released. We've been using this a long time. AWS does everything in the bottom, and the customer's responsibility is top. And what we've heard through a lot of customers is that this top piece can be challenging, right? There's like 5,000 APIs in AWS. There's over 5 different security options you can choose from. It's like a smorgasbord of options that you can do. It's awesome, right? It gives you a flexible environment, but a lot of customers have said, just give me the cliff notes. Give me the recipe and how to build a system in AWS so I don't have to go do a lot of reading or go to lots of classes. Just give me the cliff notes that I can feel confident on how to build security and how that translates over to an accreditation package. So that's what we've tried to do here. Once again, these are common problems we've seen or common challenges we've seen across public sector. Everyone has to meet compliance. They want to take care of new features and new services, but they want to make sure they do it in a very controlled way so they don't introduce risk into their systems. There's a lot of critical decisions that need to be made in order to feel secure in AWS. And the last one, which we've heard a lot, and I wouldn't have thought this was going to be like this, is mapping security controls to AWS services can be challenging. Has anyone tried that? It can take a long time. Anyone know how many controls are in a moderate level system? If I have any compliance folks, people, you can probably shout it out. It's over 300 controls in moderate, probably over 400 controls for high. A lot of customers have tried to map 400 controls to every service they use in AWS. If you use 10 services, well, you got to do 10 mappings, and you got to take all the configurations of how you build in AWS and translate that over to the language which auditors can understand. Can you imagine how difficult that is? Has anyone gone through this before? Some people probably have. What we want to do is help automate that. Shared responsibility model. What we want to do is try to map different security controls to different third-party frameworks. So for instance, if you're using NIST 853, you have a control called AU9. This is all about audit information. But you need a lot of information to prove to your auditors how you are maintaining that control. When you configure something in AWS, how are you meeting that control language? That can be somewhat challenging because a lot of the compliance folks that are working on documentation aren't always the ones that built the system, right? And that translation can be just kind of difficult. And you have that across all of the different third-party frameworks. PCI, DSS, HIPAA, CGIS, and some others have a way that they want you to write the control language around, and that can be challenging depending on how many controls there are. So what we've decided is to try to give you tools and information that you can feel comfortable with so you can build in AWS, automate your systems, and then give you all the documentation around controls to actually go with it. Make sense? All right. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to transfer it over to Mike Dixon here. He's going to go a little bit deeper in some of the concepts that I just talked about. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it up with a really cool demo to show you how you can do security, in a much more pervasive and kind of innovative way in AWS.
All right, thank you, Brett. So Brett kind of outlined some of the common challenges customers have with adhering to compliance requirements in the public sector. And so how do we simplify all this? How do we make it all easier? Well, I think it was touched on a little bit, and I like that slide that kind of shows the different compliance controls and implementations. Because there's a difference between security and compliance in some ways, and a lot of compliance controls are not very prescriptive on how to technically implement things all the time. So a lot of what we've tried to do is help provide customers with prescriptive guidance on how to implement them based on best practices. So very often we start with, you want to know what your compliance framework is. You want to know how to translate each requirement within that compliance framework to an implementable control. So you want to know what does that mean in terms of architecting a VPC, or how I do patch management, or how I harden my AMIs. There's a lot of different considerations to take into account, but that's kind of the starting point. And you also want to consider, there's a concept called inherited controls. So one thing great about using AWS is in that shared responsibility model, I know everyone has seen it before. It seems almost like a annoying image sometimes because it's in so much security documentation, but it actually gives you, it kind of demonstrates the fact that by using the global infrastructure, by inheriting those services from AWS, you do inherit certain compliance controls from that global infrastructure. So the things like the physical security, the physical network, those things you're not managing anymore. So what that means is when you go to the process of getting an ATO, of going through your accreditation, you don't want to be looking at, you want to know which controls are being inherited, which ones are customer responsibility, and then which ones, where do you implement them in the infrastructure? Where do you implement them in your application? So you want to take advantage of, obviously, we'll talk more about this, but you might have heard today somewhere, infrastructure as code. So using AWS, you can automate everything. You can use, for example, CloudFormation to templatize your environment end-to-end from your infrastructure, your VPC layer, all the way down to your actual applications. And the great thing about that, it makes things easier to use, but from a compliance perspective, that means you can actually have consistent compliance controls being implemented across applications. And so you want to take advantage of infrastructure as code, services like CloudTrail, Config, Inspector, we'll talk more about. And of course, we have plenty of partner solutions related to security and compliance. But finally, you want to automate standard implementations. You want to automate those baseline security config within your environment. For example, you might have a VPC architecture that meets a HIPAA requirement or a PCI requirement, and you want to apply that across workloads to be able to scale. So you've probably heard the term automation at some point. So why automate compliance? Why automate anything really? It makes everything much easier. That's the first reason. But you're also lowering cost. You're reducing human interaction, so there's less room for human error. So in AWS, you can go in and deploy everything manually using the AWS console or the CLI. But first of all, you're not having consistency in how you implement things all the time. And you want to be able to deploy sometimes across environments, across different AWS regions, and ensure that the way you're implementing security and in turn compliance is going to be consistent, not just with best practices, but with what your organization requires to get accreditation. So you look at, some deeper dive on automating compliance. essentially, we talked about infrastructure as code, and by doing that, you're basically managing your infrastructure like software. So if you're familiar with a lot of DevOps methodologies and processes, you can actually validate your code before you even deploy anything. So before you deploy a VPC architecture or before you deploy a set of standard IAM policies, you can actually check those from the code level. And there's even a concept that goes beyond this called, it's software related, called test-driven development, where you're building basically around your requirements, you're building test cases and test tools that you actually design your code and architecture completely around those test cases, so you're ensuring compliance end to end. And standardization, we talked a lot about, with infrastructure as code and with using AWS CloudFormation and other tools, it kind of gives you the capability to have a modular design of your architecture. So for example, you might, when you go to deploy an application, want to deploy with a standard set of IAM roles or IAM policies or VPC architectures. So you can kind of break those down into individual modules, standardize them, ensure they're compliant, and not have to reinvent the wheel every time you go to deploy an application. And of course, the fact that you're using all these capabilities, you're also able to scale much better. So this gives the capability to actually enforce compliance and security throughout the enterprise. You have a lot of transparency and visibility. As Brett had mentioned, everything's an API call. And you can also implement continuous monitoring, which is really important with compliance because I think, as was mentioned earlier, that 3-year mark from when you get your ATO to when you have to reevaluate that, almost all systems change somewhat or another. So you can have continuous monitoring and continuous compliance throughout your enterprise. So we're going to just highlight a few tools because we talk about automating compliance and what does that mean and how do we do that? And in AWS, there's plenty of different tools you can use and services. One thing we're going to dive deeper into is the AWS Compliance Accelerator, which basically provides you a kind of prescriptive guidance in the form of a deployable reference architecture based around specific compliance frameworks like PCI or NIST. And not only is it a reference architecture that's deployable and automated, but you can actually, it provides like a security controls mapping so that your security auditors and your security team can actually map compliance controls to how they're being implemented. And obviously, it was talked about in another session, I think, was the Telos Exacta governance risk compliance suite they've actually made some enhancements, which we'll have a link to, which can help your compliance team. It integrates with Compliance Accelerator, but you can also look at inherited controls, be able to actually reduce the amount of controls you need to evaluate as part of an ATO. Another thing we're going to look at is config and config rules. So AWS Config, if you're not familiar, basically allows like a full CMD-like tracking of all your resources in your AWS account. And the great thing about that, there's an enhancement called config rules, where you can actually build custom config rules that can be triggered when a configuration change occurs. And what does that mean in terms of security compliance? You can actually build rules that are based around compliance controls. And you can determine, basically in continuous monitoring, that if something changes, like a security group, that it's violating compliance and be notified immediately. So it allows a lot of levels of automation here. And I also did include Inspector, which is a great tool for, I think, recently released the past year, but it has a lot of compliance features built in there. There's actually different agents that can run on your instances and be able to evaluate things like the CVE vulnerabilities. And Trusted Advisor is not really a compliance tool specifically, but what it'll do is it'll look at your account for various AWS best practices. And among those are security. So that can certainly be useful. So with a lot of our customers, and this is just purely an example, most of our customers have this process, not just within deploying an application, but with actually getting accreditation to where they start with development and they eventually end, obviously with production. But within the context of that, you have these steps in order to achieve accreditation. So for some customers, you might, obviously ATO, authority to operate, but there's also some customers might have an IATT, which is an interim authority to test, if you know the Dixon language. But the concept here, regardless of how you actually handle your accreditation process, is that you can start with a baseline before you even start developing your application in AWS, a baseline set of standards that are mapped to compliance controls. And you can use things like the Enterprise Accelerator, CloudFormation templates, and even integrate that with AWS Service Catalog and use things like Telos. And then when you get into development, though, you take advantage of a lot of AWS tools. You're starting with a good baseline that allows for you to, the whole point of all this is that you don't want to get to a situation where you go to get your application deployed and your ATO gets kicked back and you're spending 3 or 4 more weeks trying to get this application to your end users. So once you get your IATT and you're in test, the great thing about using AWS and managing your infrastructure as code using CloudFormation is that if you're familiar with DevOps and continuous integration, you can actually incorporate things like automated tests, just like you would a piece of software. And you can do that for compliance controls. So you can integrate automated tests. You can use things like AWS Config when you deploy things in your test AWS environment and actually validate it doesn't violate any controls. And of course, once we get into production, it's great once you get an ATO. That's certainly a milestone, but what does it mean after that? Compliance shouldn't really end after you receive an ATO. So with using things like AWS Config, Amazon Inspector, using partner solutions like Trend Micro, you can actually ensure continuous compliance. Through automation, you don't have to wait 3 years again to evaluate that application. So just taking a quick look, AWS Config, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but basically you can, config rules is backed by Lambda functions. So you can basically design a Lambda function which will allow for validation within the environment continuously, whether or not, for example, a EC2 security group has a change that violates a compliance rule, like opening a certain port that shouldn't be open. And you can obviously have high levels of automation here. On the right side, you can actually standardize your config rules for compliance into CloudFormation templates and deploy them across the enterprise. And of course, before we even that's continuous monitoring and post-deployment. Before we ever deploy anything, we can actually, just like you would with software code, you can actually validate before you deploy something whether or not you're violating compliance. So for example here, you might have a rule that says by compliance, you must have, you can't have open access to port 22 on a security group. And using something like, there's an example tool called CFN NAG that I linked to there, but it's not the only one. But essentially what that'll do is let you create a test where you can validate a CloudFormation template, and it'll look at the security group resources that you have, and you can see whether or not you can basically design a test that will look for port CIDR IP 000, which is all open for port 22. So these are just some common points of validation you can do. You can look and see if our S3 buckets that you're going to deploy with a template, do they allow open access? Do IAM policies, are they not exercising least privilege that's in line with the compliance? So there's a lot of things like elastic load balancers. One of our compliance accelerators actually implements specific TLS policies on your load balancers, and you can actually check for that because it's all being managed as code. So just taking a quick look at the flow of a compliance control, and we're running up on time, so I'm just going to go through real quick. Basically, SC7 And this is purely an example. You might have a control that says, the information system must deny network communications traffic by default and allows network communications traffic by exception. So, that can be considered many things, but essentially within our compliance accelerator, if you start this process of developing your standardized infrastructure as code, you're starting with a good point where you comply with the 853 control here. And how do you know? Well, it implements things like specific security group rules or specific network ACL rules that ensure that traffic is only explicitly allowed. And when you get into things like testing, you can actually run integration tests and unit test against your CloudFormation templates to ensure that a security group resource isn't being deployed, which allows wide open access. And of course, once you're in production, you have a number of tools. Among them is config rules, where you can continuously validate so that if somebody goes in and makes a change manually, you can be notified immediately, and you can have automated remediation. So I think it's a good time now to really go into this concept of the Compliance Accelerator for Compliance Enterprise Accelerator. So we came up with this over a year ago because working with customers, one of the things we realized is we provide all types of best practices. We provide lots of ways of doing things in AWS, but one of the things that we weren't very prescriptive on is recommendations around compliance. It's great to say, you inherit this many compliance controls, and we have, our FedRAMP package that you can review, and all these other often NDA available documents. But what does that mean if I have this? You look at the shared responsibility model of security in the cloud. How do I implement that in the cloud for NIST 853 compliance or PCI compliance or HIPAA? So the Compliance Accelerator is basically a package solution that provides managed automation in the form of CloudFormation templates and detailed documentation, as well as, and this is actually a very important part of it, is the security controls mapping. So basically, it's a deployable reference architecture that provides not just a best practice that you can automate to deploy for a compliant application, but you can actually map the implementation of how each resource is deployed in this reference deployment to an actual compliance control. So essentially, we have CloudFormation templates it includes, and it's modular, it's reusable. So we think of architecture in layers. So we might have things like access management, which is your IAM configuration, your policies. You have various types of VPC structures you might use, and then of course other parts of it that you might take and implement in your application. And the idea is to make a set of templates that is completely reusable across multiple workloads, can be modified as needed. So this is a great benefit to customers because even though we do, for example, include a sample application in most of our enterprise accelerators, we intend customers to be able to modify things as needed. And by giving them a good starting point, they can know they're complying with 853 or PCI. And just to kind of give you a quick example, we're actually using the AWS QuickStarts. If you're not familiar with QuickStart, it's basically deployable reference architectures. So we've had them for a number of years or for a while now, and we have them for SharePoint, for Active Directory, for example. Well, we've actually used this as a vehicle to kind of deliver a lot of these compliance accelerators to the public. And we have ones right now for PCI compliance. We have individual packages for NIST High, NIST FedRAMP High, which includes Trend Micro. And also more recently, NIST, a newer version of the NIST 853 we released that includes mappings for DoD SRG, Trusted Internet Connection, and also 800.171. So, and if you're not familiar, if you're from the DoD space, there's the Secure Commercial Cloud Architecture, which we're expecting around late July. So be on the lookout for that. So we'll have all links to this at the end, but I think at this point I really wanted to get to actually showing you guys the Compliance Accelerator. So I'm going to hand it over to Brett.
All right. So now is what I believe is the best part of the presentation for you, probably the worst part for me, because this is when Murphy's Law usually kicks in at this point in time. But as I said, what we're discussing here is providing automation. One second. Automation along with the compliance documentation so you can go faster, right? And that's the point, right? We want to go faster, and we also want to go with more confidence. We can go with more confidence if we automate and reproduce things over and over again, maybe pre-approve reference architectures for a particular organization and then just kind of give them out like an app store to your developers. But more importantly, you can make sure that all of the security is built in. And so using these quick starts that I want everyone to go check out, will actually give you all of the automation it takes to build a secure reference architecture that's production ready. It's not just academic, it's actually a real live architecture that has all the relevant security controls turned on. It sets up security groups and network ACLs and S3 buckets and auditing and config rules to look at compliance drift. You could do all that for yourself, but what we'll do is we want to do a lot of that heavy lifting for you. So we'll give you the scripts, and it's all in the form of quick starts. At the same time, we'll give you all the compliance documentation to go with it. Since you're configuring your system in a certain way, we know that you comply to AC2 or AU4, and we'll provide that documentation for you. So I wanted to give you a little rundown of how it works. We tried to make this really, really easy, right? If you make security easy, it'll get done, right? Make security complicated for everyone involved. Does it get done right? Probably not, maybe, right? The idea is if you can make it transparent for your developers and good and robust for your security admins, they'll have a lot more confidence to go faster into the cloud. So that's what we would like people to do. Take our templates, own them for yourselves and your organization, take out the things that are relevant or not relevant to you, put in things that are, and then standardize them, and then give them out to your agencies. Give them a good starting point to start with. Developers will love it because, one, they don't have to figure it all out, and all they do is want to write code anyway, right? But you also get consistency and repeatability, and that's what's really important. So how easy is it? If you go to aws.com/quickstarts, you're going to see a lot of different ones, but the ones I wanted to talk about today, and these are all open for you, are our 3 quick starts that we have out currently, one for PCI DSS, one for NIST-based assurance frameworks, and one for NIST High. Pretty cool stuff. We'll give you the automation along with all of the controls matrices to go along with them. If we click on NIST, we're going to see that this is actually going to help you be compliant to the 171, 853, FedRAMP overlay pilot, DoD SRG, CNSSI, FedRAMP, and FedRAMP Plus. I think I just called them that way. We'll actually have all the documentation to help you, one, build a system in about 30 minutes to meet those requirements, and two, give you all the documentation to go through it. So how hard is it? You hit a button, right? Launch QuickStart. It automatically opens up your CloudFormation screen, pre-fills a JSON file in there, and you hit next, and then it's going to load it in. You're going to fill out a couple different things. You get a database password because this actually sets up an RDS database for a sample application for WordPress that it's going to install for you to give you a sample application of how an app can run in the cloud in a very resilient and a very highly available way. So you have to give it a database password. You're going to give it an email address. This email address is going to send you all the security-related events that are going to happen in your environment. If someone changes IAM, it's going to notify you. If anything happens in CloudWatch that's security relevant, it's going to notify you. That's what it's there for. All of this can be pre-done for you in this quick start, and you can modify it to your heart's content. You're going to give it some SSH keys. You're going to say if you want to support config. As Mike was saying previously, config's really cool because it'll actually do drift detection. It'll actually show you what's changed. Or you can write rules to say, Only allow approved AMIs. If a developer tries to use his own AMI, send me an email because that probably shouldn't be done. All this is built into the template. So you can create the, you can choose the availability zones you want to deploy, and you hit next. Next. And done. Now, as soon as you hit done, it actually starts building. Let me see if I can get this all on the same screen. And all of a sudden, you're going to start seeing progress. Remember I said it's very modular. We have different templates that do different functions. That way you can use certain templates, modify them for your own use, or not use them at all. But each template is very modular, like building blocks, right? So in this, what it's doing right here is it's actually creating the entire infrastructure from stem to stern. It's setting up your IAM rules. It's setting up all your production VPCs. It's setting up development VPCs. It's setting up all your logging. It's actually doing 280 API calls to set up an infrastructure that's production ready. Pretty cool, right? So as it's creating, it takes about 30 minutes, and if you can actually log on anyways, and I'll just kind of show you what's going on here. It'll actually start sending all of the ACLs, the network access control list. It'll start creating your VPCs. And at the end, in about an hour, you'll have a fully workable system that not only meets best practices, but it'll actually be compliant to several third-party frameworks. Pretty cool. This is all free, and that's the first question people always ask: is how much is this going to cost? Everything you can download free from our website. One of the things I did want to show you is actually what it builds. You're not going to see a lot of the magic because it's building a lot of the system as we speak. It takes about 30 minutes. What it's actually building, if you scroll down here, if you go to our documentation on our website, it's actually building a full 3-tiered web app that spans multiple AZs. It also creates multiple VPCs. It creates a management VPC, so you can actually do ingress and egress filtering of all system administrators that go into your environments. It creates a production VPC, which only allows developers to go from the management into the actual production. If you want to, you can create a development VPC as well. Why is this architecture important? Because there's a lot of controls that say you need to segment your operations away from each other. Your development should not be in the same VPC as your production. So it's actually building this for you. It sets up all of your network ACLs. It sets up all your logs. It sets up all the pertinent security that you're going to need to feel comfortable with building in the cloud. If you scroll down into each one of those VPCs, you're going to see a 3-tiered web app set up for you. Remember I said it sets up RDS? It also sets up a fully, highly available WordPress website, right? We have a proxy layer, which is here, which you could use SSL termination or X509 authentication on. Behind that, we actually have app servers that are running the app for WordPress, and then of course you have your RDS database. Now, are you ever going to probably use this WordPress in production? I hope not. But it really gives you a good example on how you can build, using code, an enterprise-level application, and in this case it's WordPress, but you could easily drop your own application in where this is in order to be confident in what's going on. The other part I wanted to mention was the control mapping. From the website, you can download a control mapping, which goes through, for this particular case, all the NIST controls. We actually went through all 1,800 NIST controls and mapped the pertinent controls to the proper guidance information that is contained within these templates. We actually map each one of the templates and how it complies to a certain control. I can't go through this all now because it's 1,800 lines than a spreadsheet. But what you can do with this spreadsheet is actually take it and make it into an artifact in your actually SSP to get your ATO to go faster. So I encourage everyone to reach out to the QuickStart site and take a look. Pretty cool? All right. So we can do it through CloudFormation, but wouldn't it be cool if there's other ways of doing this, right? Right? We can use APIs. We can use the CLIs at AWS in order to deploy these reference architectures for your architecture. But there's even cooler ways of doing that. I think you can use the standard APIs, but since everything is centralized, it opens up a lot more power to a lot more technology to do things you never did before. And one of the things I wanted to show you, and how I believe is going to change the game in the next couple years. Does everyone know what this is? This is an Amazon Echo. Most people play their music with this, right? Anyone have one of these in this room? Someone has to have one. This actually uses the AWS cloud. Most people use it for entertainment. I say use it for security. I say use it for your provisioning team. Wouldn't it be cool if you could just tell Alexa to build me a secure architecture? And she can do it. Right? Wouldn't that be cool? Forget the keyboard, forget all this stuff. Imagine your provisioning team is now Alexa. Pretty cool? Because everything is API driven in AWS, it opens up a lot of possibilities. So I wanted to show you how this actually works. All right, here's where the demo goes. I'm going to hope it's going to work. Load demo.
Hello, Brett. I have loaded the Alexa-powered AWS Enterprise Accelerators. I will demonstrate how automation and security can go together like peas and carrots. I am ready to build security-focused QuickStart environments. You can choose to launch environments that conform to PCI, NIST, or CJIS security standards. What would you like me to do for you?
Describe NIST.
The NIST QuickStart deploys a standardized environment that helps support National Institute of Standards and Technology certifications, accreditations, and compliance processes.
What are my options?
To build a PCI-based environment, say launch PCI. To launch a NIST-based environment, say launch NIST. To launch a CJIS-based environment, say launch CJIS. If you need help, say help me. What would you like me to do?
Launch NIST.
I am building a NIST-compliant AWS infrastructure. Please see CloudFormation Management Console for details.
How cool is that? Right? Because the power of AWS is all API driven, imagine the possibilities of not just...
I can't find the song.
Quiet. Imagine the possibilities. This is your provisioning team, right? You're no longer going to be constrained by laptops or APIs. You can use your natural power of your voice to not only do cool stuff like music, but to control and manipulate your architecture in a much more pervasive way. The last demo I'm going to show you is something we built specifically for this. It's not only using Alexa as a provisioning team, we're going to use her as a security officer. Right? She plays music, she's a provisioning team, and she can look at people's environments and tell you if you're compliant or not. Wouldn't that cool? We talk about continuous monitoring all the day long, but what happened if you could say to Alexa, am I compliant? And she can come back and query the APIs and figure out, are you compliant or not? Think how powerful that can be. Now, we're going to set up just a proof of concept, just for this demo. I'm going to show you kind of the art of the possible and what we're going to see in here today. But think about the possibilities. When you take these devices that are hooked to the cloud and they can talk to the same APIs that your infrastructure is in, imagine the possibilities we can do in the future. So what I'm going to show you is the ability for Alexa to generate a compliance report. It's not doing it on last week. It's not doing it 3 years ago for an ATO. She's going to query the APIs. When I say generate a compliance report, she's going to go through my infrastructure and provide all the security relevant configurations to an email. Pretty cool? Want to see if it works? All right, we'll give it a shot. Load security operations.
Hello, Brett. I have loaded my security and continuous monitoring routines. I am now monitoring the security of your application within the AWS US East region. What do you want me to do?
What is my security status?
Your application and AWS infrastructure are secure and configured to meet DoD SRG requirements. No security relevant configuration changes have been detected in the last 24 hours.
Generate compliance report. Takes a minute.
A link to your compliance report has been emailed to you.
Thank you.
No problem, Brett. Remember, security and compliance can be fun and entertaining.
Now, what you didn't see is that she's actually talking to the AWS cloud. You've given her a role or an IAM privilege to query your infrastructure through a Lambda function. And then she is building an HTML page, which then can be delivered as an email to you, so you can get in-time results of how your environment is compliant. So if I go check my email, first one is your compliance report. Just came in at 4:50, and she actually gives you a link to a signed URL, which you can download your entire compliance report that's based in what exactly your configuration is today. So you just click on it, it's going to download it. Now this is a proof of concept, but what we decided to say is she actually queried our account. She sees that we have 3 VPCs. And if you start dropping down into those 3 VPCs, she's going to show you all of the security relevant information in real time. She's showing you that all of your subnets that I have created in my account. She shows me all my route tables, all of my security groups of exactly how my account is actually done. My elastic load balancers, my app servers, my entire application that I just showed you is running, and it shows you what is going on. In fact, if you go and you actually scroll over a security group, it'll actually highlight the one that it's using above. Look at that. Imagine what you could do. You could actually do a delta of this from yesterday or today or 6 hours to provide that real-time information on how you're being compliant or secured at certain standards. Now, we did this in about 4 hours. This is just one Lambda function. But imagine what you could do using a little creativity in order to not only help developers move faster, but actually be more compliant and more secure and have more visibility in the AWS cloud. Cool stuff. If anyone wants it, we are free to, we will provide it. This is once again done just as a proof of concept inside of our team, because we wanted to demonstrate kind of the art of the possible, and that this doesn't have to be just a music player. It can be a real awesome piece of your security staff in order to maintain a high level of security so you feel confident to go in the cloud. Now, will everyone use this? No, not everyone is going to use it, but it shows you the power of the APIs that you can do around security and compliance in AWS. So we believe if you go to our website and you download our templates along with our security documentation, we really feel that you can automate compliance and make it easy, right? And that's what everyone really wants, right? So thank you guys. We're going a couple minutes over. I appreciate your patience. If you have any questions, please let us know.